Welcome to Vivid Voices, the channel where you can relax and enjoy captivating stories. So put on your headphones, close your eyes, and unwind as we bring you the enchanting tales of Disney princesses. The tale of Snow White. It's one of the oldest and most magical stories ever told, full of wicked queens, enchanted forests, and the purest kind of friendship. So gather close and let Grandpa tell you how it all began. Once upon a time, in a kingdom far, far away, there was a queen sitting by her window sewing during a cold winter's day. Now, this wasn't just any window. It had a frame of ebony as black as night. As the queen worked, she glanced out at the snow-covered landscape, and in doing so, she pricked her finger with the needle. A drop of her blood fell onto the white snow, and as she looked at the contrast between the red blood, the white snow, and the black window frame, she thought to herself, "Oh, how I wish I could have a daughter with skin as white as snow, lips as red as blood, and hair as black as ebony." Time passed, and soon enough, the queen's wish came true. She gave birth to a beautiful baby girl who had skin as white as snow, lips as red as blood, and hair as black as ebony. They named her Snow White. But alas, the queen didn't live long after the child was born, and the kingdom was soon ruled by a new queen, Snow White's stepmother. Now, this new queen was as beautiful as she was vain. She had a magic mirror that she cherished above all else. Every day she would stand before it and ask, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" And the mirror would always reply, "You, my queen, are the fairest of them all." This pleased the queen greatly, and she was content knowing that no one in the kingdom could rival her beauty. But as Snow White grew older, her beauty blossomed. By the time she turned 7, she had become even more beautiful than the queen herself. One day, when the queen stood before her mirror and asked her usual question, she was shocked to hear a different answer. "You, my queen, are fair. It is true, but Snow White is even fairer than you." The queen's face darkened with jealousy. How dare someone else be more beautiful than her? Enraged, she called for a huntsman and ordered him to take Snow White deep into the forest, kill her, and bring back her heart as proof of his deed. The huntsman led the innocent girl into the woods, but when he raised his knife, he looked into Snow White's big, kind eyes. His heart softened, and he couldn't bring himself to harm her. "Run," he told her. "Run far into the forest and never return to the castle." Snow White, frightened and confused, ran as fast as her little legs could carry her. The huntsman, to trick the queen, killed a wild boar and took its heart back to the wicked queen, telling her it belonged to Snow White. Believing Snow White to be dead, the queen felt satisfied, and once again, she asked her mirror who was the fairest of them all. With Snow White out of the picture, the mirror answered, "You, my queen, are the fairest of them all." Meanwhile, poor Snow White wandered through the forest, unsure of where to go. The trees loomed over her like giants, and strange sounds filled the air. But after hours of wandering, she stumbled upon a small cottage, deep in the woods. It was a charming little house, but everything inside was tiny. There was a tiny table, tiny chairs, and 7 tiny beds. Exhausted from her journey, Snow White curled up across 3 of the little beds and fell fast asleep. Now, this cottage belonged to 7 dwarfs who worked as miners in the mountains. When they returned home that evening, they were surprised to find their home wasn't as they had left it. There were crumbs on the table, and one of their chairs was moved. And when they looked in the bedroom, they found a beautiful young girl sleeping on their beds. "Who is she?" one of the dwarfs whispered. "Let's not wake her," another said. "She looks like she's been through something terrible." When Snow White awoke, she was frightened at first, but the dwarfs were kind, and soon she told them her story. The dwarfs, moved by her tale, offered her a place to stay. "You can live here with us," they said, "but be careful, the queen will come looking for you. Stay inside and don't let anyone in while we're away." Snow White agreed and settled into her new life, keeping the house tidy while the dwarfs were off working in the mines. But back at the castle, the queen, feeling victorious, once again asked her mirror, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" To her horror, the mirror responded, "Snow White, who dwells with the 7 dwarfs, is still the fairest of them all." The queen's face twisted in rage. "Snow White is alive," she hissed. She knew she had to take matters into her own hands. Crafted a poisoned apple, and disguising herself as an old farmer's wife, She made her way to the cottage. When Snow White opened the door, the queen offered her the apple. It looked so delicious with its shiny red skin that Snow White couldn't resist. She took a bite and immediately fell to the ground as if dead. This time, when the dwarfs found her, nothing they did could wake her. They wept for Snow White, placing her in a glass coffin so that they could always look upon her beautiful face. Days passed and the dwarfs kept vigil over her. One day, a prince riding through the forest happened upon the cottage. When he saw Snow White lying in the glass coffin, he was struck by her beauty and fell in love with her at first sight. He begged the dwarfs to let him take her back to his kingdom. As the prince's servants carried the coffin, they stumbled, and the piece of poisoned apple that had been lodged in Snow White's throat was dislodged. She opened her eyes, alive once more. The prince, overjoyed, asked for her hand in marriage, and Snow White, grateful for his love and kindness, agreed. They returned to the prince's kingdom and were married in a grand celebration. And as for the wicked queen, when she asked her mirror one last time who was the fairest, the mirror answered, "Snow White, the new queen, is the fairest of them all." Enraged and humiliated, the wicked queen was never heard from again. And so Snow White and her prince lived happily ever after, surrounded by love and joy. There you have it, the story of Snow White, a tale of kindness, love, and how goodness always triumphs in the end. The story of Meirda, the fierce and fiery Scottish princess with hair as wild as her spirit. Once upon a time, in the mystical highlands of Scotland, there was a young princess named Meirda. She was not like the other princesses you might have heard of, that while most young ladies were learning to embroider or behave with grace, Meirda preferred riding her horse, Angus, through the thick forests, practicing archery and exploring the rugged landscape. She was skilled with a bow and arrow, and her aim was unmatched by anyone in the kingdom. Meirda's mother, Queen Eleanor, loved her daughter dearly, but she was always trying to teach her how to be a proper princess. You see, one day Meirda was expected to rule the kingdom, and Queen Eleanor wanted her to be well prepared. But Meirda, well, she wasn't interested in any of that. She didn't want to be tied down by rules or traditions. She longed for freedom to live life on her own terms. One day, as Meirda's 16th birthday was approaching, the queen delivered some news that Meirda did not want to hear. The lords of the 4 clans were coming to the castle, and each would present a son as a suitor for Meirda's hand in marriage. This was a tradition, one that ensured peace and unity among the clans. But to Meirda, the very thought of getting married to someone she didn't love was unbearable. As the day of the competition to win her hand approached, Meirda came up with an idea. Since the suitors would compete in a series of games to prove their worth, she declared that as a firstborn herself, she would compete for her own hand. And compete she did, choosing archery, her greatest skill. She astonished the crowd by outshooting every one of the suitors, even splitting one of their arrows in half. While the crowd was amazed, Queen Eleanor was furious. She and Meirda argued fiercely that night. In her frustration, Meirda felt that her mother simply didn't understand her desire to choose her own path. In a moment of anger, Meirda stormed out of the castle and into the dark woods, riding fast and far from her home. It was in the woods that Meirda stumbled upon a strange sight, a little cottage deep in the forest. Inside was an old witch, though at first she appeared to be a harmless woodcarver. Desperate to change her fate, Meirda asked the witch for a spell to make her mother see things her way. The witch agreed and gave her a magical cake, instructing her to give it to her mother. Thinking this would solve all her problems, Meirda returned to the castle and gave Queen Eleanor the enchanted cake. But instead of changing her mother's mind, the spell had a terrible consequence. After eating the cake, Queen Eleanor began to change into a bear. Now, you have to understand, in their kingdom, bears were feared and hunted. The transformation was slow at first, with Queen Eleanor still keeping her human thoughts and emotions, but Meirda knew time was running out before her mother would fully become a bear, both in body and mind. Meirda was horrified by what she had done. She knew she had to reverse the spell before it was too late. Together, Meirda and her now bear mother fled to the forest. They sought out the witch's cottage, but the witch had vanished, leaving behind only a cryptic message: mend the bond torn by pride. Meirda didn't know what this meant at first, but she was determined to save her mother. In the wilderness, Meirda and the Bear Queen learned to survive together. Over time, Meirda began to understand her mother's perspective, realizing that while she wanted her freedom, her mother's expectations came from a place of love and care. And Queen Eleanor, in turn, saw how brave, capable, and determined her daughter truly was. As Meirda pieced together the meaning of the witch's riddle, she realized that mending the bond referred to the torn tapestry in the castle, the one she had slashed in anger during their argument. With her mother's time running out, Meirda raced back to the castle, determined to repair both the tapestry and her relationship with Queen Eleanor. But when they arrived, they found the castle in chaos. The lords and their men were hunting the bear they believed was terrorizing the kingdom, not knowing it was their beloved queen. Meirda grabbed the tapestry and, using all her skills, managed to sew it back together, hoping this would break the curse. But before she could finish, a terrifying battle ensued. Her father, King Fergus, known for his hatred of bears after losing his leg in a bear attack, came face to face with his Bear Queen wife, unaware of who she truly was. Meirda threw herself between them, begging her father to stop. At the last moment, just as her mother was about to fully lose her humanity, Meirda wrapped the repaired tapestry around her mother, tears streaming down her face. She whispered, "I'm sorry. I love you." And just like that, the spell was broken. Queen Eleanor slowly transformed back into her human form, embracing Meirda with all the love and relief in her heart. The bond between mother and daughter, once torn by pride, was mended not just in the tapestry, but in their hearts. From that day on, Meirda and her mother ruled side by side, each having gained a deeper understanding of one another. Meirda would go on to lead her kingdom with the same bravery and wisdom that she showed on that fateful journey, but also with the knowledge that family, love, and compromise are just as important as freedom and independence. And that, my dear, is the story of Meirda, the brave princess who discovered that the real power of leadership comes not from doing everything alone, but from understanding and working together with those you love. All right, gather around, and I'll tell you the tale of Rapunzel, the girl with the long golden hair. It's a story that's been told for generations. So sit back and let Grandpa take you on this magical journey. Once upon a time, in a land far, far away, there lived a man and his wife. They were kind-hearted and good people, but oh, how they longed for a child. They had been hoping and praying for many years, but their house remained quiet, with no little footsteps running about. Now, their home stood next to a large, high-walled garden that belonged to a witch. Oh yes, a mean old sorceress named Dame Gull. She guarded that garden fiercely and didn't let anyone set foot in it. One day, as the wife looked out of her window, her eyes fell on the garden, and there she saw the most beautiful plants growing. One plant in particular caught her eye. It was Rampion, or Rapunzel, a leafy green that looked so fresh and inviting. The more she gazed at it, the more she craved it. Soon she became so desperate to have some that she grew sick and pale. Her husband, worried for her health, asked, "What's troubling you, my dear?" With a weak voice, she replied, "If I don't get some of that Rapunzel from the garden next door, I fear I shall die." Now the man didn't know what to do. He didn't want to upset his wife, but he was terrified of Dame Gothel. Yet, seeing his wife growing weaker each day, he finally decided to sneak into the garden and steal some Rapunzel for her. Late one night when the moon was high, the man climbed over to the garden wall, his heart pounding in his chest. He quickly grabbed a handful of the precious Rapunzel and hurried home. His wife ate it with great delight, and it seemed to bring her back to life. But oh dear, it wasn't enough. The very next day, she wanted more. So the poor husband, loving and worried as he was, climbed back into the garden. But this time, as he bent down to pick the Rapunzel, a shadow loomed over him. It was Dame Gothel, her eyes flashing with anger. "How dare you steal from my garden?" she hissed, her voice sharp as a thorn. "You'll pay for this." The man, trembling with fear, fell to his knees and begged for mercy. "Please, forgive me. My wife saw your Rapunzel, and she craved it so much that she grew ill. I had no choice but to take some for her." The witch stared at him, her expression softening just a little. "Very well," she said slowly. "I will spare you, but on one condition. When your wife gives birth, you must give me the child. That's the price you'll pay." The man was horrified, but what could he do? He agreed, and sure enough, when his wife gave birth to a beautiful baby girl, Dame Gothel came to claim her. She named the child Rapunzel, after the plant, and took her away to raise as her own. Now, Dame Gothel wasn't much for loving or caring. She raised Rapunzel in isolation, keeping her hidden from the world. As the girl grew older, the witch locked her away in a tall tower deep in the forest. The tower had no stairs, no doors, just one little window at the very top. Rapunzel grew more and more beautiful as the years passed, and her hair grew long. Oh, it was the most magnificent hair you'd ever seen, golden as the sun and long enough to reach the ground below her tower window. Every day, Dame Gothel would visit the tower, and she'd call out in a sing-song voice, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair!" And down would tumble that glorious golden braid, as thick and strong as rope. Dame Gothel would climb up, hand over hand, until she reached the window. Now, Rapunzel, lonely in that tower, with no one to talk to except the birds and the breeze. She would sing to herself to pass the time, her sweet voice drifting through the forest. One day, a prince who was riding through the woods heard her singing. Her voice was so pure, so full of longing, that it drew him closer and closer until he found the tower hidden among the trees. He watched from the shadows and soon saw Dame Gothel approach. "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair," the old witch called, and to the prince's amazement, he saw the golden braid fall from the window and the witch climb up. The prince, clever as he was, waited until Dame Gothel was gone. Then, when night fell, he stepped forward and called softly, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair." Thinking it was the witch, Rapunzel let down her braid, and up the prince climbed. When he reached the top and saw the beautiful young woman, he was smitten right away. Rapunzel was startled. She had never seen a man before, but the prince was kind and gentle, and soon they fell in love. From that night on, the prince would visit her in secret, and they began to plan an escape. But one day, Dame Gothel noticed something was different about Rapunzel. She could tell that the girl was keeping a secret, and in a fit of rage, she discovered the truth. "You traitor!" Dame Gothel screamed. In her fury, she grabbed a pair of scissors and cut off Rapunzel's beautiful hair, casting her out into the wilderness, all alone. That same night, the witch waited in the tower with Rapunzel's cut-off braid. When the prince came calling, she threw the braid down as usual, and up he climbed. But instead of his beloved Rapunzel, he found the wicked witch waiting for him at the top. "You'll never see Rapunzel again!" Dame Gothel shrieked. In despair, the prince leaped from the tower. Though he survived the fall, the brambles below scratched his eyes, and he was blinded. For many months, the prince wandered the land, searching for Rapunzel. He called her name, but no one answered. He was lost in his sorrow, with no hope of finding her. But fate had other plans. One day, as he stumbled through a forest, he heard a familiar voice. It was Rapunzel, singing the same sweet song that had first brought him to her. He followed the sound, and when they were finally reunited, Rapunzel wept with joy. Her tears of happiness fell upon the prince's eyes, and miraculously, his sight was restored. Together, they returned to the prince's kingdom, where they were married and lived happily ever after. As for Dame Gothel, well, some say she was never seen again. And that, my dear ones, is the story of Rapunzel, a tale of love, bravery, and a golden-haired girl who found her freedom. The story of Cinderella, one of the most beloved fairy tales of all time. So, sit back and let Grandpa tell you how this poor, kind-hearted girl found her way from rags to riches with a little bit of magic and a whole lot of hope. Once upon a time, in a faraway land, there lived a sweet, gentle girl named Cinderella. She lived with her father, but after he passed away, Cinderella was left in the care of her cruel stepmother and two selfish stepsisters. Her stepmother was cold and unkind, and her stepsisters were jealous of her beauty and charm. They made poor Cinderella work from dawn until dusk, doing all the cooking, cleaning, and housework. The poor girl had no time for herself. She had no fine clothes or jewels, and the only place she had to rest was a small dusty corner by the fireplace, where the cinders and ashes often covered her. That's how she got her nickname, Cinderella. But despite her hardships, Cinderella remained kind and hopeful. She didn't let the cruelty of her stepfamily turn her heart cold. She would often sing as she worked, dreaming of a better life, where she could be happy and free. Now, one day, news spread throughout the kingdom that the king was hosting a grand ball. You see, the prince was looking for a bride, and every eligible young lady in the land was invited. Cinderella's stepsisters were overjoyed. They spent days preparing, trying on fancy dresses, and talking about how one of them might marry the prince. Poor Cinderella helped them get ready, doing their hair and ironing their dresses. But deep down, she wished she could go too. She longed to wear a beautiful gown and dance at the ball, just like the other girls. But when she asked her stepmother if she could go, her stepmother laughed cruelly and said, "You? Go to the ball? In those rags?" And with that, her stepsisters sneered and rushed off to the ball, leaving Cinderella behind, heartbroken. As Cinderella sat by the fireplace, her tears flowing like rivers, she suddenly heard a soft, tinkling sound. Looking up, she saw a kind old woman standing before her. This was no ordinary woman. This was her fairy godmother. "Why are you crying, my dear?" asked the fairy godmother in a gentle voice. "Oh, I wish I could go to the ball," Cinderella sobbed, "but I have nothing to wear and no way to get there." The fairy godmother smiled kindly. "Well, we can fix that," she said with a twinkle in her eye. With a wave of her magic wand, the fairy godmother transformed Cinderella's rags into the most beautiful gown you've ever seen. Silk and satin of the finest kind, with sparkling jewels sewn into the fabric. On her feet, she wore delicate glass slippers that gleamed like the stars. Next, the fairy godmother waved her wand over a pumpkin in the garden, and it magically turned into a grand golden carriage. She transformed 6 mice into elegant horses, a rat into a coachman, and 2 lizards into footmen. Cinderella couldn't believe her eyes. "Now, my dear," said the fairy godmother, "you may go to the ball. But remember, this magic will only last until the stroke of midnight. After that, everything will return to the way it was." Cinderella promised to be back in time, and with a heart full of joy, she climbed into the carriage and set off for the palace. When Cinderella arrived at the ball, the whole room went silent. The prince, who had been watching the door all evening, was captivated by her beauty the moment she stepped inside. He immediately asked her to dance, and they spent the whole night together, gliding across the dance floor, lost in each other's eyes. Cinderella was having the most wonderful time, but as the night wore on, she noticed the clock inching closer and closer to midnight. In a panic, she suddenly remembered her fairy godmother's warning. "I must go," Cinderella cried, pulling away from the prince. "But wait, I don't even know your name," the prince called after her. Cinderella didn't stop. She dashed out of the palace, running down the steps, but as she ran, one of her delicate glass slippers slipped off her foot and fell onto the stone steps. She didn't dare stop to pick it up. She ran all the way back to the carriage just as the clock struck midnight, and with each chime of the clock, the magic faded away. Her gown turned back into rags, the carriage became a pumpkin, and the horses turned back into mice. Cinderella ran home, out of breath but filled with happiness. She had danced with the prince, and it had been a night she would never forget. The next day, the prince was determined to find the mysterious girl who had stolen his heart. All he had was the glass slipper she had left behind. He ordered his servants to go throughout the kingdom, trying the slipper on every maiden until they found the one whose foot fit perfectly. When the servants arrived at Cinderella's house, her stepsisters eagerly tried on the slipper, but their feet were far too big. Then, just as the servants were about to leave, Cinderella stepped forward. "May I try it on?" she asked softly. Her stepsisters laughed, but the servant allowed her to try, and wouldn't you know it, the slipper fit perfectly. The servants rejoiced, for they had found the prince's true love. They whisked Cinderella away to the palace, where the prince was waiting for her. When he saw her, he knew right away that she was the girl from the ball. They were married in a grand ceremony, and Cinderella became the princess she was always meant to be. And so, Cinderella's life of hardship and sorrow came to an end. She was no longer a servant, but a beloved princess, living in the palace with her prince, where they lived happily ever after. And that, my dear, is the story of Cinderella. A story about how kindness, courage, and a little bit of magic can change your life in the most extraordinary ways.